Good afternoon, everyone. I hope people at the University of Toronto can hear me, and I trust the people online can hear me. We'll get this underway, I think, as expeditiously as possible. My name's Robert Reddy. I'm the Executive Director of the Canada Caribbean Institute. I'll be back in just a second to explain a little more information, but I would like to get us started by welcoming Beverly Mullings to the podium. I'm not going to take the time to go through Beverly's academic accomplishments. It would take us too long. But she is the director of the Center of Caribbean Studies at the U of T, and we're very happy to be collaborating with her on this event. So without further ado, Beverly, I would turn it over to you to welcome everyone.
Wonderful, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this lovely occasion where we will get to sit and talk and listen and ponder questions around Caribbean security, questions around law, questions around land. So I want to welcome everyone here, and I want to open with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that this land on which the University of Toronto operates has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. It's the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The territory is subject to the 1701 Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this is also the home to many other Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, Abya-Yala, and beyond. And we're grateful for the opportunity to work and to share in community on this territory. As a descendant of peoples who were enslaved and peoples who were enslaved, as I'm particularly sensitive to the violence of colonialism's present and past, and the importance of acknowledging the deep continuities between the injustices of the past and those in the present. And it's only through acknowledgement and accounting for the past that we can begin to imagine and chart paths towards just futures. So I'd like to say welcome to everyone, both online and in the room. Special shout out for all those in the Caribbean. We have weather today that probably is comparable, but not for long. I think it disappears tomorrow. And with that, I just want to do one other thing to alert you to a whole slew of activities happening in the Center for Caribbean Studies, but one in particular that I want to draw your attention to. Well, actually two. Tomorrow will be movie night, and we'll be showing Green Days by the River in the Robots Library. And I've got a list if you're interested that you could have a look at where to find a room. And then on Wednesday, we will have the amazing Olive Senior, who will be speaking at book launch of her newest book, Paradise Once. And with that, I'll hand over the rest of the event and introductions to Robert, who will tell us a little bit about the Canada Caribbean Institute. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks very much.
My name is Robert Reddy. I'm the Executive Director of the Canada Caribbean Institute, which is a collaboration between universities and colleges in Canada and the Caribbean. It was founded about 4.5 years ago. We have 13 members at the present time, 13 post-secondary institutions. And the objective of the CCI is to encourage research collaboration and exchanges between faculty and students in Canada and the Caribbean at the post-secondary level. We're also very taken with the advancement of the bilateral relationship in its many forms, and we have a website and a blog where we try to promote and encourage those activities that advance the relationship. We also hold a number of panels, discussion panels throughout the year, sometimes in collaboration, as today. Sometimes we do it on our own, and we organize an annual research symposium. Last year's was in McMaster at McMaster University. The next one in February 2026 will be in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's through activities such as I've described that we try to fulfill our mandate. I just wanted to make a couple of administrative notes. This video stream is being recorded, and it would be posted for view on the CCI website as soon as I can make arrangements for that after this event. Questions from the online audience, if you have them through the presentation, just put them in to me on the Q&A on the Zoom platform, and I'll make sure that they're read out for reply during the question period at the end of the session. I would now like to turn to Mariana Prada. She is the Associate Vice President and Vice Provost International Student Experience at U of T and a Professor of Law at the William C. Graham School of International Law and Development, University of Toronto. I'm really happy to collaborate with Mariana today. Mariana is on the board of directors of the CCI, and it's great to see this kind of collaboration between one of our members and the Center for Caribbean Studies. And we look forward to future collaboration of this kind. But Mariana, with that, I would turn it over to you to make introductory remarks and introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for the collaboration. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to see all of you here. Hello to everybody who is attending online. I am absolutely delighted that we're having this event here today. I may be mistaken, but I think this is the first CCI event we have at U of T campus. I hope the first of many to come. So please stay tuned. But as Robert said, the website has a wealth of materials that might be of interest to you if you're interested in Caribbean Canada relations and related topics. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Kevin Davis is the Beller Family Professor of Business Law at New York University School of Law. His research and teaching generally concern the relationship between law and economic development, with particular emphasis on anti-corruption law, commercial law, and measurement of the performance of legal systems. I must disclose that Kevin is not only a researcher that works in areas that I also have an interest with, but we have co-authored a few pieces and collaborated extensively, and I would even claim we are close friends, I think. I may be taking liberties here. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today with us, Kevin. Kevin's publications include over 50 articles or essays, 4 edited volumes, and a monograph that I highly recommend, called Between Impunity and Imperialism, the Revelation of Transnational Bribery, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. He has held visiting appointments at Cambridge University, Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo, University of Southern California, here at the University of Toronto, and the University of West Indies, Barbados, and has lectured in many of the top academic institutions around. most importantly, Kevin has very deep ties with Canada. While he joined the NYU Faculty of Law in 2004, and where he also served as Vice Dean for Global Affairs. But before he went there, he was actually a tenure member here at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, where he graduated from. And he also clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada, which is just so big. So I believe this is a little bit of returning back home. I hope we're enticing you to come more often, Kevin. And without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and thank you, Beverly, Robert. It's really a pleasure to be here speaking to a group of people who are interested in the Caribbean, because ordinarily I have to explain why I write about the Caribbean. Because I write about other places as well, because I have this general interest in the relationship between law and development. But recently I've written not only the paper I'll speak to you about today, but also about Haiti and the effects of the first Haitian constitution and the significance of it. And I suspect I'll continue to write about the Caribbean. But when I explain this to people, there is this question: why? Why don't you write about bigger places that are more significant, where law has an impact on a larger number of people, or whose legal systems are more likely to influence other places in the world? So why don't you stick to Brazil or India or China or South Africa? And so that's the question. And sometimes the responses are interesting. Not my responses, the speculation, the conjectures about why I do it. Obviously, some people presume it's because of sentimental reasons, because I'm also Jamaican as well as being Canadian. I had one interesting reaction in a cab ride in Chicago, actually, where I told someone that I was interested in Brazil and Jamaica, and they said, "Oh, Brazil, Jamaica, which one's bigger?" And I said, "Well, Brazil, just a bit." And he said, "Oh, really? No, I'm surprised by that, because you meet more people from Jamaica." So for him, at least, it wasn't a mystery. But in general, I get a little bit of sort of curiosity about the reasons, because the actual reason is none of the above. It's that I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at the Caribbean that's of much broader interest for people who are interested in the general relationship between law and economic or political or social development, which is my interest. So that's the rationale. And so that's what today's paper is going to be about. How do I do the slides? Yep. Okay. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, as you've heard, I'm a lawyer and interested in how law affects society in various ways. And in my profession, and people who do what I do, the norm is to focus on the relationship between national law and whatever social or economic or political outcomes you care about. That's the standard approach for most people, right? So the relationship, this diagram means something to me, even though it may not mean something to the rest of you. At the top are the states, and at the bottom are the societies. And usually there's this assumption that, well, the society is influenced primarily by its domestic law, and vice versa. The people who shape the domestic law are members of the society by which it's directly governed, right? So that's the standard approach. I don't think it's as simple as that, right? That just doesn't work. In a globalized world, given the amount of movement of goods and capital and people and information, relationships between one society and another are quite complicated, and the relationship between law and society is complicated by that kind of globalization. So I think actually the picture is something like this. Now, there's a whole other group of lawyers who will talk about the role of international law, right? So that oval at the top, the way that international law affects the prospects, say the development prospects of societies, whether it's international trade law, international investment law, maybe international human rights law. That's also a well-recognized field of study. That's not what I want to focus on today. What I want to focus on are the other ways in which legal institutions beyond the domestic legal institutions affect social, economic, political outcomes. And basically, I'm thinking of what you might call foreign law. So not emanating from the United Nations or some treaty or something, but from some other country, the legal systems of the United States, the European Union as a whole, whatever, how that might affect, say, a country like Jamaica, right? Or Canada, for that matter. So what I suggest is there are three distinct channels through which that kind of influence can occur. The first is through what I call regulatory diffusion, where the norms from one society affect the law of another one. So the most simple example of this is the colonial encounter, the way in which, say, British law or French law has affected the laws in places like Jamaica or Haiti, right? So that would be regulatory diffusion, which continues through the present day, through the post-colonial period. But the colonial encounter would be the most obvious example of that. Next, we've got extraterritorial regulation, where the foreign law affects the society you care about, not through the domestic legal system, but instead directly, where, say, the United States decides to prosecute a foreigner for bribes paid overseas, right? This happens from time to time, and that's called extraterritorial regulation, where the foreign law applies directly to activities and people in another society. So that's the second channel. The third channel is the one that's probably least noticed and has been least discussed. It's the one I call regulatory spillovers, where the foreign law doesn't purport to apply to anything that's happening in another society. It only applies within its territory, but it still has spillover effects because it applies to people who might move or who are connected to people in other jurisdictions, or to goods that might be imported into another jurisdiction or imported from another jurisdiction. So a simple example would be some of the European Union's regulations. I'm accustomed to speaking, as I mentioned, I'm accustomed to speaking to legal audiences and often European legal audiences for whom this is their bread and butter. The European Union has a whole slew of regulations now that are designed to restrict the entry of goods that were produced in violation of human rights norms or that in ways that are incompatible with their obligations under climate change treaties. And so those rules only apply to things that enter the European Union, but of course they affect activities outside the EU. So that would be the third example, the sort of international regulatory spillovers. And so I'm interested in the ways in which those three channels account for and help you understand what's going on in any given society. Right? So that's the theoretical question that I'm interested in. And what I've found useful is to think about that in the context of the Caribbean, and more specifically in relation to Jamaica. Because when I try to explain this idea to my legal colleagues, they'll say, oh, well, it sort of matters at the margin, maybe, or maybe it's important in Europe, but it's not an issue for us, right? So the first step in sort of building out this way of looking at the world was to look at how this plays out in the context of, that's sort of the most likely case, in the context of a very globalized society. And the Caribbean's great for that, right? Because Caribbean countries generally are nothing if not globalized. They're susceptible to so many foreign influences, beginning, of course, with the colonial influences. Right? But it continues just in terms of openness to trade, the amount of migration back and forth, the reliance on remittances, right? The influence of foreign culture, right? In all of those ways, along all those dimensions, Caribbean countries are sort of exceptional, right? And so then it makes them a perfect context and makes them perfect cases for analyzing the impact of globalization, including the kind of legal globalization that I'm talking about here. So what I've done is I've focused on Jamaica. And the idea was to pick a highly globalized society and show that there's a facet, there are aspects of the society that at first glance don't seem to be very connected to anything overseas. It's not like I'm looking at, the bauxite industry or something, or tourism, but a set of social outcomes that at first glance you might think are very domestic, determined primarily by domestic factors, domestic institutions, but in fact show that they're influenced by foreign legal institutions, right? So that's the idea. So what I picked for Jamaica was homicide, which is obviously a very salient feature of the society. As many of you know, Jamaica is constantly vying for sort of one of the top few spots in the charts in terms of homicides per capita, unfortunately. And so the question is, can we understand patterns in homicide in Jamaica over time by looking primarily at domestic legal institutions, like say the death penalty or number of police officers and so forth? Or does it also help to look at the influence of foreign laws? Right. And so what I'll do is just walk through a timeline. This chart shows the number of homicides per capita in Jamaica over time as it's changed over time.
The people online can't see the slides, so I'm just gonna.
Okay.
Sorry.
Great. Okay. So this graph shows the homicides over time, right? And sadly, it slopes upward for the most part. And I just want to pick some of the key inflection points and talk about what was happening legally at those points in time, not just in Jamaica, but also overseas. And the first thing to notice is the low starting point. This doesn't go back before 1971 or so, but before independence, homicide in Jamaica was actually remarkably low, right? It was something like 4.6 per 100,000, as opposed to some of these like these are not this isn't the rate. Sorry, what you got here are the absolute numbers, but the rate has gotten up over 60 at its peak. But in 1962, it was 4.6. Right? When I talked to my mother about what it was like living in Jamaica in the 1950s and 60s, she describes it as the most peaceful place on earth almost, and talks about walking home from political rallies, sort of singing with her friends, arm in arm, and late at night in downtown Kingston. And so that hasn't been the reality of downtown Kingston recently, but at one point it was, right? So we have this very low starting point and then a steady increase beginning after independence. Throughout this period, right, the entire period shown on this graph, one of the factors that's influenced the level of homicides, or two of the factors, have been the trading drugs and guns. Right? So that began in the case of the marijuana trade in the 1960s, and around 1980 or so, it shifted towards cocaine. So that's been one factor that has led to a certain amount of violence in terms of conflict between gangs, essentially, and that's the amount of that has fluctuated over time in ways that I'll discuss in a second. And then the other factor, of course, is firearms, because the vast majority of homicides are committed using firearms, and the vast majority of those firearms come from the United States. There was one study at one point that suggested that most of them could be tracked to just 3 counties in Florida. Right? So in each of those cases, of course, that reflects the influence of not only what's happening in Jamaica, but also American law and Canadian law and European law, right? That's generating the demand for generating the demand for illicitly trafficked drugs and varying the levels of enforcement as well. Or on the firearms side, the enforcement of firearms laws or lack thereof, both in terms of the initial sales and also the exports, right? And the amount of inspections at ports, right? So there's a sense in which those would be the first factors that I'd point to as reflecting, at least in part, the influence of foreign laws. Next, we've got this dramatic increase through the 1970s. Some of that would be explained by economic conditions, including the influence of the IMF austerity program in 77. Again, I'm not trying to say how much of an influence this played as opposed to anything domestic, but it was a factor, right? And then, of course, violence peaked in 1980, right around the elections. This was right around the time my family left. And that was primarily political violence. There's a story you can tell that some of the political violence was caused by political polarization, which was in turn caused by the entrenchment of a two-party system, right, in the Constitution. Whether you treat the Constitution and that feature of the Constitution as something that's the product of Jamaicans, or that reflects the influence of the British, who, because it was a negotiated Constitution, it's not clear, but it's hard to see it as being exclusively Jamaican. So at each point, you see what I'm doing here. At each point, I want to suggest that the factors that are explaining changes in patterns of homicide include a mix of the domestic and the foreign, right? And sort of domestic legal factors and foreign legal factors. Okay, another story that's sometimes told is about the role of the death penalty. There's a suggestion that the increase in the level of homicides that you see beginning at the end of the 80s through the 90s could be explained by essentially the abolition of the death penalty. It's not abolished, but the fact that Jamaica stopped executing convicted criminals. That story is also interesting, right? So one version of it is that it's largely the result of foreign influence, that it reflects a decision of the Privy Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which is a British institution, but it's also the court of last resort for Jamaica, right? Which said that it was a violation of human rights to keep people on death row for, say, longer than 5 years, and that made it very difficult to execute people. And then there was a whole series of decisions that followed that made it increasingly difficult to conduct executions, which had the effect basically of stopping execution. So that's one story, that it's the result of this foreign influence, reflecting not just the Privy Council, which is only arguably foreign, but the foreign personnel on the Privy Council, the British human rights lawyers who persuaded them to make these arguments, the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence that influenced the British judges, and then also there's a domestic, sort of regional component, the jurisprudence of other national courts in the Caribbean that all shaped this outcome, right? So you could tell that story. There's a different version of the story that would emphasize the domestic factors, saying, well, there was a longstanding domestic abolition movement that culminated in the 1992 reform that limited the scope of the mandatory death penalty, right? So that would be much more, an argument that's much more important what was going on the national side. Either way, and you would also emphasize the role that Jamaican lawyers played in those arguments before the Privy Council. And you'd say, no, the Privy Council is a Jamaican institution as opposed to a European one. You could go either way on that. For me, what's important is that there's a mix of influences, right? A different story about what explains the change through the 90s is deportations. Beginning with some reforms in US immigration law and criminal law, started between 1986 and 1996, the number of people being deported from the US and then a bit later on from the UK skyrocketed. It sort of doubled between 1994 and 2004. And this is a significant impact on Jamaican society, as many of you would know. There was a 2016 study that suggested that 2% of the population was deportees. Right? So that happened. That's not controversial. More controversially, there's a suggestion that that's linked to crime and violence. There's some statistical studies that suggest that. I'm not going to necessarily endorse them, nor am I going to endorse any particular hypotheses about what explains any relationship, whether it's that the deportees would be the victims of violence or the perpetrators, and whether it's the absence of integration programs that explains it. That's not central to the story. The main point here is that, again, in the literature, in Caribbean studies at least, the deportees, the results of US immigration law, British immigration law, and Canadian law as well, have had an impact on conditions in Jamaica, right? You can't ignore that, right? That's the way I'd put it. Okay, skipping ahead to 2010, the Tivoli incursion, which some of you may have heard of. There's this big dip that we have to explain in the death rate. That reflected bizarre and tragic episode where there was a drug, which some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, where there was a drug dealer named Dudas, Christopher Koch, who the US wanted to extradite from Jamaica. And they sent the extradition request in 2009. The government sat on it for a while. Finally, they were, for various reasons, compelled to try to execute it because they received word that he was barricaded in Tivoli Gardens, which is one of the garrison communities in downtown Kingston. And so they sent in the military and the police, 800 soldiers, 397 police officers. They used mortars in downtown Kingston to assault the neighborhood. They did not get their man, at least not that way. Right? They got him a month later after the whole assault was over, and he was coming into the city, not going out. So somehow he slipped through the net, and 69 civilians were killed as part of the operation. So tragic in many, many ways, but one of the apparent consequences was this dramatic fall in the homicide rate for the next few years afterwards, probably reflecting the combination of disruption of the gangs and the increased police presence in some of the communities, right? So that was, and again, it's the US request that's triggering all of that. That was a catalyst for this truly remarkable event in Jamaican history. So that's Tivoli. The last thing I'd like to mention is what seems to be driving a lot of the homicides in the post, say, 2013 period. How many of you have heard of the lotto scam? Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I'd asked this question in a talk on Friday, and no one had. So this is an improvement. It's a scam where they tell you that you've won the lottery or sweepstakes. The only catch is that you need to send a processing fee or some sort of transaction fee if you want to claim your winnings, right? And it's obviously not just a Jamaican thing, but it became particularly popular amongst some Jamaican groups to perpetrate this scam on people in the US and Canada and so forth. And it was extremely lucrative. You'd be amazed how many people fall for it, right? And so it's resulted in tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, people estimate, flowing into the country. But also, after, say, 2013 or so, a lot of violence, people fighting over the lead sheets, the contacts lists that they use to decide who to call, and maybe over the proceeds as well. It's not clear what led it to turn violent, but one story that Jovan Lewis has is that it was about the increased enforcement, right? Under pressure from the US and the international community, the Financial Action Task Force and so on, that, so there was increased enforcement, not only on the part of the Jamaicans, but also by the US, which would extradite people and prosecute them, right? So prosecute them in US courts for perpetrating these scams. And they also cracked down on Western Union and eventually entered into a settlement with them for laundering the proceeds of these scams. So there's US enforcement in that extraterritorial sense that I mentioned, right, where they're just prosecuting people directly for their activities that they undertook in Jamaica, as well as through the Jamaican legal system. Right? So that's the story I wanted to tell, which suggests that there are all these different points at which you can say that, well, that pattern, understanding the pattern of homicide in Jamaica, it's obviously a function of domestic legal institutions in part, but you can't ignore the role of the foreign, right? The foreign institutions, not the international, the foreign legal institutions, if you really want the full picture. Right? So what I make from that is, if you want to, first of all, just understand Jamaican law generally. It's important to understand foreign law. That's a general theoretical point, both in terms of what sources you're going to look at, and if you're going to be comparing Jamaica to some other country, you shouldn't be only focusing on the nature of the domestic institutions. So you shouldn't always compare Jamaica to Barbados just because they're both, I don't know, common law. That's actually a common rationale for that particular comparison. But instead, you might want to compare Jamaica to somewhere like the Bahamas, which is susceptible to US influence in a similar kind of way and is more of a transit point for narcotics, for instance, and maybe guns in the way that the Bahamas are. So there are implications, I think, for the study of Caribbean law and Jamaican law in particular. There's implications for other countries like Jamaica. So if you're thinking about Haiti, it means that when you're thinking about Haiti, you should only think about Haitian law, but you should also think about the implications of abrogating temporary protected status for all the Haitians so many Haitians in the United States and what that's going to do for Haiti, right? You can't ignore the role of US law in understanding what's going on in Haiti. So that's another implication. But what I've tried to show in some of my other work is that it also has implications for other countries outside the Caribbean. So I've got a whole other paper about the US and how it's influenced, how US privacy law and the practices of US companies in relation to privacy are affected by the EU's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. And that's a quantitative study where we trace that implication, but the theoretical framework is the one that I worked out in this paper. It's that same sort of spillover effect, as opposed to any direct extraterritorial application. There are applications in other areas of law, like legal history, for instance. So it was very interesting this summer to spend some time in Brazil and hear from Brazilian scholars, especially in the Northeast, how much interest they're starting to take in the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian Constitution, and how it affected the drafting of the Brazilian Constitution. Right? Because of this, Haiti was the negative example. There was the fear of the slave revolt that sort of tilted some of the drafting of the provisions of the Brazilian Constitution, 1825, I guess. So there's that kind of implication. Or in the field of comparative constitutional law, my friend and colleague at the University of the West Indies, Tracy Robinson, she's been doing fascinating work on the dyadic nature of Caribbean constitutions and what that means and what that should tell scholars of comparative constitutional law, because you don't see that in a lot of other places, right? This sort of divided authority and so forth. So anyway, that's why I study the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular. It's probably was self-evident to most of you, but thanks for indulging me, and I look forward to the conversation.
You need to do anything here?
This
Sure.
chair. These are Kevin's slides.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm delighted now to introduce the commentator for Kevin's talk, Kamari Maxine Clark, who is a distinguished professor here at the University of Toronto. For more than 20 years, she has conducted research on issues related to legal institutions, human rights and international law, religious nationalism, and the politics of race and globalization. She has spent her career exploring theoretical questions concerning culture and power and detailing the relationship between new social formation and contemporary problems. One of her key academic contributions has been to demonstrate ethnographically the ways that legal and religious knowledge regimes produce practices that travel globally. Clark has produced 9 books with over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. I was trying to compare the list of publications between you and Kevin. I think it was really even, yeah. And she's the author of Effective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-Africanist Pushback, Fictions of Justice, and Mapping, may mispronounce this, Yoruba Networks. And in addition to her scholarly work, she has served as a technical advisor to the African Union, a legal counsel, and produced policy reports to help the African Union navigate various international law and United Nations challenges. She is the recipient of a number of prizes. I would spend the whole day reading here if we were to list all of them. I just want to call attention to the most recent one, the Guggenheim Prize for Career Excellence. And I must just add a personal note. Kevin mentioned Tracy Robinson, and when Tracy was teaching with Kevin at NYU, the course on Law and Development, which is a course that I also teach here at the University of Toronto, Tracy mentioned to me that she and Kevin inhabited very different universes. I think it's a little bit the same with Kamari and Kevin, so we're gonna have a very interesting different perspective on the issue that Kevin talked about. Kamari, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mariana. And it's good to see you back in this hemisphere. We were just in Indonesia, in fact, together at a conference, and both of us somehow made our way here. And we were talking about how jet lagged we truly are. And I complained that I couldn't get to bed and didn't fall asleep till about 4 this morning. So it's in that context that I join you, but I really am thrilled to be here. And thank you, Professor Davis, for your presentation and your paper. Before I start, I wanted to say something else, which is that there's nothing more annoying at times than an interdisciplinary conversation when the paper has just been published. So, so I'm well aware that the Law and Social Inquiry, this paper was just published, and I do want to raise some points in the spirit of interdisciplinarity and collegiality. And so what I'll do is identify those 4 points, and maybe just do a very brief summary of what I understand the argument to be, as a way then to enter the 4 interventions that I'd like to make. And so in Davis's article, what he refers to as the significance of foreign law, what we see in the article and what he's outlined very nicely for us is that what we see is an examination of traditional source-based methods of legal analysis. And of course, he posits an alternate framework for understanding law and society in an increasingly globalized world. The key argument, as he outlines, is that law ought to encompass what he calls foreign laws and associated enforcement practices when studying societal issues. He insists that focusing exclusively on a nationalistic source-based method that, and this is actually in the larger argument, he didn't specify precisely in his overview, but I'm sure that people have already also had a chance to take a look at the article. But this idea that focusing exclusively on nationalistic source-based methods, which is a traditional approach in legal analysis that examines domestic laws alone in and of themselves in a closed forum, is inadequate. And instead, he insists that it's especially inadequate in contexts and in regions that are so highly globalized. And he identifies Jamaica as one of those sites of significant cross-border flows. And so, to illustrate the limitations of what he sees as the source-based method, then the Jamaica case study and the high homicide rates for him is really a key place for thinking about that critique. And the fundamental claim then, as we saw and as we heard in his outline, is that legal determinants of homicide in Jamaica aren't confined to the Jamaican criminal justice system, but instead needs to include the ways that we understand the circulation of US, UK, Canadian laws and practices related to firearms, narcotics, trafficking, deportation, extradition, and of course, cross-border fraud. And so he insists that understanding the relationship between law and society in Jamaica requires defining the relevant laws based on the subjects that they affect, rather than nationality or the nationality of their sources or source-based analysis. And so, of course, he structures his argument accordingly and thinks about various forms of circulation. And we saw the primary components in the outline in the graph, diffusion, extraterritorial regulation, and as well spillovers. And so this sets the framework for this subject-based method. And what is certainly an important intervention, and there are a lot of contributions that are part of that intervention. One, of course, is the methodological one, which is that methodological nationalism problematically dominates legal studies still today. And this is primarily one of the arenas that he's fighting against or pushing beyond. He's insisting on providing a different template for transnational socio-legal research, and fundamentally wants to think about the way that ordinary social issues like homicide are actually and deeply entangled with global regulatory networks. And so here we see an attempt to open particular pathways for research and think about legal globalization and the network systems of governance that aren't confined by borders. Now, in thinking about those contributions and the setup and the kind of methodological interventions, I'd like to highlight 4 areas that I think are worth pressing further on and are worth considering. One, I call the temporality of violence, or the challenge with analyzing Black on Black violence simply in a post-independent period. And Kevin, I have to say that the image of your mother post-independence walking hand in hand after a rally, I guess this was around 1962 post-constitutional, okay, so post-independence, is an interesting image, and in some ways further troubles the critique that I want to start with, and for the sake of engagement. There's another place in the article where Professor Davis says that Jamaica has not always been a violent society. And of course, this sits nicely with his mother after the protest and the context in which safety was certainly celebrated, especially for earlier generations in Kingston and the big cities. Now, what I'd like to say is that in many ways, violence is multidimensional, that homicide is indeed one extreme outcome of violence. It would be useful to hear when we think about violence, when we think about the challenges of homicide, I would be interested in hearing more about the analytic decision to exclusively center homicide and not other forms of non-lethal violence. So assault, sexual violence, domestic abuse, police brutality. I mean, that even before the colonial period certainly is a key trouble point, especially around Black men in cities throughout the island, and certainly structural and systematic forms of harm. And so Caribbean theorists have long critiqued, one dimension, of course, is why focus just on homicide? What does it mean to look at homicide in and of itself and to disaggregate that from other forms of violence? I'm sure that's a question that has emerged in your own work over time. But the other, it has to do with what I see as a post-colonial critique of the focus on violence in this way, post-independence. And we know that Caribbean theorists have long critiqued legal coloniality through a deepened historical and epistemological grounding of post-colonial critique. We might think about the underpinnings of Jamaican life that was deeply embedded in plantation violence, and the fact that we continue to live in the wake of that violence. Said another way, Jamaica's contemporary homicide rates in many ways cannot be understood apart from its violent plantation and colonial history. And there's a strategic decision that was made there to look at post-1962, but I don't know that post-1962 and the disaggregation of the island social and economic structures that were born out of plantation slavery, then a system that relied on violence, racial hierarchy, and certainly the denial of humanity to enslaved Africans, particularly dark-skinned Africans, continues to be relevant. And so these legacies of domination and inequality, of course, didn't disappear with emancipation or with the independence. Instead, they evolved into new forms of structural and interpersonal violence. So Jamaica's high rates of crime and social unrest today are deeply linked to this historical trajectory in which power and oppression were organized along racial and economic lines. And so this violence that is a manifestation of the contemporary period certainly isn't incidental to plantation life. In fact, it was the organizing principle. And so when the British seized control of Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, and sorry to go back to that, but let me just, in order to make this point, it was the British who then from 1655 moved on to develop a plantation economy centered on sugar production. And of course, this system was built entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans, and Africans were whipped, mutilated, executed, etc., in order to suppress rebellion. The planter class, we know, used violence to create and sustain wealth, while British law codified racial hierarchy, positioning white planters at the top and enslaved Blacks at the bottom. And post-emancipation policies and post-colonial politics preserved these inequalities in many ways, transforming physical slavery into structural marginalization. And so violence, once the tool of the masters, became the language of the dispossessed. And so fast forward to the post-colonial period, even after independence in 1962, Jamaica's social structure remained marked by inequality. The majority of Black Jamaicans continued to live in poverty, and of course, concentrated in urban ghettos, and many in the rural regions migrated to Kingston seeking work. And so conditions of economic stagnation, of course, unemployment, inadequate housing, and the list goes on, continue to demarcate and put in place the systems of marginalization that emerged. And so fast forward to political violence and gun culture of the 1960s, the rivalry between the PNP and the JLP, of course, garrison communities and garrison politics, really, again, reflects this phase of political violence where elites continue to manipulate the poor through clientelism as well as coercion. And we see the same sorts of structures of inequality that continue to render people vulnerable and also engage them in which they engaged in violent networks. And so the story goes on, of course, in the article as well, in thinking about the drug trade of the 1980s, the constituted communities and the garrison networks, and outward migration, unemployment, racism abroad, the impact of deportation, the types of criminality that emerged. And all of these component parts, of course, are part of the continuities of a historical past. And so the question, it is a long-winded one, but I think it's an important one in thinking what happens methodologically when the post 1970s period becomes the period in which we demarcate forms of violence, and earlier forms that are deeply embedded in the structures of possibility around poverty, etc., aren't part of the ways that we analyze that contemporary period. So I'd love to hear more about that decision and whether or not you agree that what we lose, though, by the post-independence is a narrative about crime and violence that distinguishes itself from the very underpinnings on which it's built. The second point has to do with the politics of agency. And this is one of those annoying questions that people in law and economic development might use to critique people like me who are socio-legal scholars, because the next point isn't unrelated to the first, but in fact interrogates the place of power in thinking about decision-making in the commission of crime. And so what we see in Davis's paper is a quite effective tracing of transnational influence of laws in order to understand global hierarchies of power and deportation and state practice. And the challenge, though, here is that is a question about who the people are who are engaged in these practices. And so what we get from the underside is a passive representation of Jamaicans who are in fact passive recipients of external legal forces and themselves not active members of this global order in which economic and political strategies are at play. And so in the paper version, there's less attention on these really, there's no attention on a theory of agency, how local actors interpret, resist, or appropriate US or other legal norms for the purposes of creating alliances, articulating entrepreneurial criminal rings, thinking about issues of cunning, and the ways that people pull themselves out of difficult circumstances. And so the question here is whether there's a space in this analysis for a discussion of the agency of crime or agency of crime involved folks. And such a question in many ways shifts the analysis of violence from a purely structural or statistical one that acknowledges the intention to one that acknowledges the intentional choices and motivations of individuals involved in violent act. And so in many ways, it is a provocation. The provocation that I offer is whether the foregrounding of agency, and in doing so, we recognize that criminal behavior is not merely a byproduct of social conditions or economic deprivation, but also involves deliberate decision-making, negotiation of risk, and responses to opportunities or constraints. The third point, it's about nomenclature. And I'm still trying to get my head around this, the invocation of foreignness in this paper, or at least theoretical ambiguity on foreignness. So Professor Davis insists that law today is best understood as transnational. In much of his work, he nods to that direction, thinking about the ways that law circulates. It's always moving, it's negotiated, it's contested across spaces of unequal power. And in this regard, his critique of the foreign national binary is compelling. And as he said in his opening, the fundamental impetus for this is to disrupt the particular methods that produce a focus on the national. But there's something unsettling, there remains unsettling for me about the way that foreign law is treated as a category. And here, on one hand, it's presented as a stable category. On the other hand, and this is in the paper, I think less so in the talk that was just offered, but in the paper, on the one hand, it's presented as a stable category. On the other hand, he argues for its dissolution. The paper presents foreign law to refer to the norms, models, or legal ideas borrowed or imposed from other jurisdictions. And of course, national law refers to laws developed domestically through a country's own legislative and judicial processes. And here, I think, is the problem with the nomenclature. Because of course, there's a recognition that British common law plays and has played a fundamental role in Jamaica's legal system, serving as the primary source of its principles, its approaches, procedures, as well as its judicial reasoning. And so as a former British colony, Jamaica inherited British common law framework. And of course, this legal heritage provides the structured approach to resolving disputes, as well as the development of case law. And so that certainly is the case. Now, one of the questions then is whether British law is conceptually still seen as foreign to Jamaica, given its colonial continuities, and does the subject-based approach ultimately render the term foreign then meaningless? For formerly colonized nations, the national system may itself be built on imported foundations. So the distinction can indeed be misleading. To what extent is foreign law and national law useful as a framing device for this argument? And my thoughts are that it seems that the language of foreign and national law is useful only as a critical tool to help expose the dynamics of power and dependency, as well as cultural and critical authority in legal systems. But if treated as literal or rigid division, it seems not as useful. And so the third point, I think, for further conversation is how do we reconcile this nomenclature? And then finally, I will end by asking Professor Davis to think with us about gender. And in a way, it's a question about disaggregating the people who are the people engaged in homicide. So Davis's article skillfully maps global legal interconnections, but there are clearly gendered particularities that are absent in ways that seem relevant. And so his focus is on Jamaica's homicide rate, and it seems to reflect violence on the island. But without a gendered analysis, we don't really have a sense of who exactly is doing the killing, who is the recipient of these murders, and what other forms of violence are actually underway. What we know is that most homicide perpetrators and victims of that homicide in Jamaica tend to be young, poor, Black men whose lives are shaped by histories of racial exclusion, economic marginalization, and colonial oppression. And this means that the violence under discussion is deeply gendered. Caribbean feminist scholars have long demonstrated that post-colonial violence is inseparable from colonial constructions of masculinity. We know the narrative and the story about the plantation economy and the ways that Black hypermasculinity portrayed Black men as dangerous and deviant while excluding them from legitimate forms of power. Modern state violence, gang warfare, policing continue to reproduce these racialized masculinist tropes. And so Davis's reliance on homicide statistics without the details of gender and disaggregation in some ways obscures this dynamic and begs for further analysis. Because young, poor Black men are not merely subjects of foreign legal influence, they embody colonially shaped masculinities marked by economic displacement as well as systemic criminalization. And so a gendered reading complicates this framework. Legal effects operate not on neutral subjects, but indeed on gendered bodies, disproportionately criminalizing and killing Black men while leaving patriarchal structures intact. So we might assume that gun and drug laws reinforce masculinized economies of violence, in fact, and US deportation policies disproportionately target men with criminal records who return to Jamaica stigmatized and often economically marginalized. But without gender, the subject of transnational law becomes abstract, erasing how legal systems differently affect men and women and limit the analytic power of the paper to presumptions without a universal subject. And so to end here, I guess the provocation and the question is to whether or not Professor Davis, you can say more about the gendered lives shaped by these laws. What are the distinctions or the differences that make a difference? And so I'll welcome thoughts on this point as well as the other points for the sake of conversation. You can pick all or none, and we can open it up for questions from the audience. But thank you for the opportunity to comment on this fascinating paper. And I'll turn the mic over to Professor Davis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful, both the summary and the provocations. Yeah, I really appreciated that. I think that I'll try to be very brief because we don't have a lot of time, but I think my general response, at least to your first and fourth points, the points about the temporality and then also gender, the role of gender, is to say, well, to duck the question in a way, because the motivation of the piece was to make a methodological point, as explained and as you set out. And so in that sense, it was not attempting to provide a comprehensive understanding of violence in Jamaican society. And so that, I think, accounts for two of the limitations that you that you so effectively highlighted. Okay, but let me go more systematically. So why not consider violence more broadly? Why focus on homicide, and more specifically homicide in the post-colonial era? It goes back to the objective, this methodological objective. I wanted to focus on what was constant. On what varied. And so the violence would have been a constant, and the colonial legacy would have been constant, but the homicide did vary in very significant ways. And that was part of the reason for choosing to show the number of homicides on the graph as opposed to the per capita rate. The fact that the number went from around 200 people per year to at its peak over 1,600 people per year, that's significant. So yes, there has been violence throughout. There's violence in the colonial period. There's violence in the post-colonial period, which may be connected. And you, Deborah Thomas, and others have written about that continuity. But that change, that variation, which is a significant number of lives, that's what I wanted to focus on. So no, it's not telling us everything about why the homicide's occurring and why the baseline is so high. And if I wanted to look at variation across countries, then I would have done something different. But because I wanted to focus on the variation within one country, I focused on the homicide, and particularly in that in the post-independence period. Okay, so there's that. On the politics of agency, you're exactly right. That's a very fair point. And there was a bit more attention to that, I think, even in my remarks than there was in the paper. That highlight the role of Jamaicans, including Jamaican lawyers, but also the offenders, the victims, and so forth, as agents, politicians lobbying for the abolition of the death penalty and so forth. All I would say is that the focus of the paper is on the fact that regardless of how much agency exists in the local settings, it's being exercised in the context of an environment that's shaped by foreign forces. That's again the focus of the paper, but you're completely right. And even as I was speaking, I realized that yes, I should say more about local agency. It's in the paper, but I think that's a very fair critique, actually, to say that it's not emphasized enough. Your third point was about foreignness being presented as a stable category. And at times, and especially here, but in the paper, I say, well, the thrust of the paper seems to be to sort of press on the validity of the category and to try to dissolve it, as you put it. And you're quite right to say that given the way that British common law works, it's difficult sometimes to decide whether British law, English law, maybe to be more precise, is foreign to Jamaican law, is foreign law in relation to Jamaican law. There's a sense in which I'd be happy to agree with you, because that's obviously the thrust of my work. But the lawyer in me says, no, there is a distinction between authority that's binding and authority that's persuasive. And there's, and you know, where that line is will vary depending on the legal system, but it is a very conceptually sharp line. There's some aspects of English law that are in force, in effect in Jamaica, and there are others that are not. And that's the foreign domestic divide. And for lawyers, it's very clear, at least in, you know, as a conceptual category. And then again, the last part about gender, again, that's just a completely fair point, but explained by, I think, by the fact that the objective was not to provide this comprehensive assessment of violence and even homicide, but just to isolate the foreign influences on it. But thank you again for the wonderful commentary.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'm sure this is a much longer conversation than, fortunately, having to cut short just because we're running out of time. We didn't trend at 1:50 because we need to give time for the students in the room to coach their classes, which means might have time for one or two questions. I'm going to turn to Robert, who is raising his hand because there might be a question online. Robert?
Thank you, Marianne. Question came in online from Professor Rachel Goff, and I'll just read it. A very interesting argument for me as a Jamaican interested in criminalization. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. Not to put you on the spot, but have you thought about how your investigation might help explain Jamaica's recent boast that its murder rate has fallen by half? Otherwise, it might seem to affirm the dramatic rise in extrajudicial police killings as a strategy for suppressing crime, and this narrative has particular significance in the context of US aggression in Caribbean waters, rationalized as anti-drug cartel policing. And she closes by saying, I have to go teach, but I'll catch up via the recording.
I just have one more question and then we can give you the floor. Any questions from the room?
I think the third point for me that Dr. Clark had presented is really the one that the entrenchment and the entanglement between where the roots of laws came from, and your explanation was great because I'm not a trained lawyer, so I appreciate in practice how that impacts of your research will translate. I'm just wondering if this idea of foreign being salient to national becomes more commonplace. How do you think that's going to affect legal practices in Jamaica and beyond?
Okay, thanks. On the question from Professor Goff, the article's analysis sort of peters out around 2020. I didn't really look at developments since then. So there's nothing in what I've done that speaks to determinants of the very recent decline in homicides, and it is very recent. And the strategy throughout was to draw on the work of criminologists and anthropologists and so forth, as opposed to making my own claims about the factors that might be explaining changes in the homicide rate. So I don't have a personal view on that. But I guess I would be loath to assume that it's simply the result of the states of emergency or that the government would be claiming have caused the outcomes. So I think I'll leave it at that. My analysis actually suggests, well, we should look at other factors as well, right? So there's that. In terms of how this way of looking at the world might change practice, well, one thing it does, I think, is it has implications for legal education, actually. Even today, my sense is that very little US law is taught in Jamaican law faculties or the law school. I would think there should be more attention paid to US law because there's lots of English law. But that would be one very practical ramification because it's something that practitioners, everyone understands how these influences work. But in terms of the formal educational structure, there's less acknowledgement of that. So that would be the most obvious ramification, I would think.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Evan, for being so concise. As I said, these are multiple conversations that could have taken the entire afternoon. And as I said in my introductory remarks, I truly hope this is only the first of many events in collaboration between CCI and the University of Toronto. And in my opening remarks, I failed to acknowledge how much Caribbean studies was central for this event to happen. So while the University of Toronto is a big place and was one of the partners, I think it was embodied in the Center for Caribbean Studies, and we're deeply grateful for the partnership.
Thank you, everyone.